In the annals of history, the Vikings are the ultimate predators. They are the wolves of the sea, descending upon Europe with a fury that made kings weep and empires crumble. But what if I told you there was a time when the wolf became the prey, a time when the legendary raiders, who feared neither God nor man, found themselves rowing backward into the sea, trembling in terror? This isn't a story of a bigger army or a sharper sword. It is a story of an enemy that weaponized the one thing Vikings didn't understand: fear itself. The year is 842 AD. A fleet of dragon ships cuts through the mist of the Scottish Highlands. At the helm stands Magnus Bloodaxe, a chieftain whose name is a curse in 3 languages. He has come for gold, for slaves, for glory. He expects a fight, a shield wall to break, a village to burn. But as his boots hit the sand, he is met with something far worse than resistance: silence. The village is empty. The fires are cold. But the hills are watching, high on the cliffs. Figures appear and vanish like smoke. They are not wearing armor. They are naked. Their skin swirled with intricate blue patterns that seem to move on their own. These are the painted people, the Picts, and they have been waiting for Magnus not to fight him, but to hunt him. For the first time in his life, the predator feels the cold breath of the unknown on his neck. The Vikings advance, their confidence unshaken. They are the masters of the battlefield, but the Picts refuse to give them a battlefield. As the Norsemen march inland, the ground itself turns against them. Pits open up to swallow armored men whole. Arrows fly from nowhere, striking with surgical precision before the archer melts back into the heather. This isn't war, it's an execution. The Picts don't charge, they herd. They guide the Vikings deeper into a labyrinth of stone and shadow, separating leaders from their men, cutting off retreat. But the true horror begins at night. The Vikings form a defensive ring, their eyes straining against the darkness. They are ready for a berserker charge. Instead, they get silence. And then, the disappearances start. A sentry turns his back for a second and is gone. No scream. No struggle. Just an empty space where a warrior stood a moment ago. By morning, the camp is a place of paranoia. The Picts are dismantling the Viking mind, piece by piece, proving that their axes are useless against ghosts. Magnus realizes too late that he hasn't invaded a territory. He has stepped into a trap set generations ago. In a grove of ancient oaks, his scouts find a terrifying message, a collection of Viking swords and helmets, rusted and arranged in mockery. These are the remains of the raiders who came before him. He is not the first to try, and he will be the next to vanish unless he breaks the one rule of his people: never retreat. The humiliation in Scotland was a lesson in psychological warfare, but far to the north, in the frozen forests of Finland, another Viking chieftain was about to learn a lesson in environmental warfare. Eric the Red-Handed led his fleet into the Baltic winter, seeking easy plunder among the scattered settlements of the Sami people. He saw them as primitive hunters, easy pickings for his ironclad warriors. He didn't realize that to the Sami, the winter wasn't a season, it was a weapon. As the Vikings marched into the deep snow, they became clumsy, slow, and freezing. The Sami, however, moved like spirits. They wore skis, long strips of wood that allowed them to glide over the drifts, while the Vikings sank up to their waists. They struck from the tree line, their arrows silent and deadly, and then vanished into the whiteout before the Vikings could even lift their shields. They were fighting a war of attrition against men who were already dying of cold. The Sami didn't need to kill them all. They just needed to wait. They destroyed the Vikings' supplies, harassed their sleep, and let the frostbite do the rest. One by one, Eric's men sat down in the snow, too exhausted to take another step, and simply drifted into the long sleep. The Sami had turned the landscape into a tomb, and the Vikings were digging their own graves with every step they took. Eric the Red-Handed, a man who had burned villages and toppled lords, found himself powerless against an enemy he couldn't touch. The Sami understood the forest in a way the Norse never could. They knew which way the wind blew, where the ice was thin, and how to become invisible. They were the masters of their domain, and the Vikings were clumsy intruders, stumbling blindly through a world that wanted them dead. The defeat was total. There was no glory in freezing to death while chasing shadows. The few survivors who stumbled back to their ships carried a story that chilled the blood of every Viking who heard it. In the north, the land itself fights back. But while the Picts and the Sami taught the Vikings to fear the unknown, the final lesson would come from within. What happens when you take the ferocity of a Viking and strip away the humanity? What happens when you create a warrior who fears nothing because he feels nothing? You get the Jomsvikings. In a fortress island in the Baltic, a new order arose. These weren't raiders. They were a cult of war. They rejected the clan, the family, and the gods. They worshipped only one thing: perfection. The Jomsvikings were the special forces of the Viking Age. They recruited only the strongest, and their initiation rites were lethal. They fought in silence, moving with a hive mind coordination that terrified traditional warriors. When Thorvald Skullsplitter, a legendary chieftain, led his men against them, he expected a brawl. Instead, he walked into a meat grinder. The Jomsvikings didn't shout. They didn't boast. And they didn't panic. They fought with a mechanical efficiency, anticipating every move Thorvald's men made. It was like fighting a mirror image of yourself, but one that had been stripped of all fear and hesitation. They killed not for glory, but because it was the most efficient way to end the battle. Thorvald watched his army disintegrate. His men, who fought for personal honor and the praise of their peers, were dismantled by men who fought as a single, unfeeling organism. The Jomsvikings proved that the greatest enemy wasn't the stranger in the woods or the ghost in the mist. It was the potential for absolute, dehumanized violence that lay within the Viking soul itself. These three encounters, the ghosts of the highlands, the spirits of the snow, and the machines of Jomsborg, changed the Vikings forever. They learned that their reputation for invincibility was a fragile thing. They learned that terror is a weapon that can be turned against you. And most importantly, they learned that there are places in the world where a dragon ship and an axe are not enough. The Picts taught them that the mind is the first battlefield. The Sami taught them that nature is the ultimate conqueror. And the Jomsvikings taught them that discipline beats fury every time. These were the only enemies who made the Vikings look in the mirror and see fear staring back. So, the next time you hear stories of the unstoppable Norsemen, remember the empty beaches of Scotland, the silent forests of Finland, and the fortress of the Joms Vikings. Remember that even the wolves have predators. But the Viking story isn't just about battles and bloodshed. It's also about survival. While their warriors were learning hard lessons on the battlefield, their families back home were fighting a different kind of war, a war against starvation. How did a people living in the frozen north survive when the crops failed and the livestock died? They turned to a menu so brutal, so disgusting, and so ingenious that it kept them alive when they should have perished. If you think fighting invisible warriors is scary, wait until you see what they ate to survive the winter. Click the next video to discover the 10 brutal foods that kept the poor alive year-round. It involves blood, bark, and things you wouldn't feed to a dog. The legacy of these defeats is not one of shame, but of adaptation. The Vikings didn't stop raiding, but they became smarter. They learned to respect the land, to study their enemies, and to understand that true power comes from adaptability, not just brute strength. These lessons allowed them to evolve from simple raiders into explorers, traders, and eventually kings of their own nations. They proved that the most dangerous warrior is not the one who never loses, but the one who learns from his defeats. So, as the sun sets on the age of the Vikings, we are left with a more complex picture of these legendary people. They were not invincible gods, but men who bled, feared, and starved just like anyone else. And it is in their struggles, not just their victories, that we find their true story. Stay curious, stay hungry, and never stop exploring the shadows of history.